Hi everybody. In this video I wanted to offer some general feedback on the two assignments that you submitted in Canvas for week 10. That is the discussion board posts on the 10 sample sources and the works cited page on the 10 sample sources that I uploaded to Canvas. So because I just felt it was easier to give you some general feedback and sort of, quote, give you the answers, as it were, so you can look back at your work and your discussion to kind of check your understanding. It just saved some time to do it this way. So as I am doing this video, as you're watching this, think about your own discussion posts and your own works cited page. I will give you a few words of feedback on the works cited page of the 10 sample sources in Canvas. But more generally speaking, this video will show you kind of what I was looking for and offer some answers for the questions I asked. So first off, let's talk about those 10 sources and let's look at whether they were primary, secondary, or tertiary sources and whether they were scholarly or non-scholarly sources, right? That's the first thing we're going to do. Just kind of check your answers in your head. Please note that if you were incorrect in some of your assessments in your discussion board, I still would have given you credit as long as you were on the right track and committing to the assignment, right? If you did something else besides trying to discuss these 10 sources, you would not have received credit. You would have received an incomplete. So you should contact me to talk about that. So otherwise, even if you were off base, that wasn't as important as you giving it a good, honest try and thinking through the challenge here. So first off, let's talk about whether each source is scholarly or non-scholarly, and then whether it is primary, secondary, or tertiary. In most of these cases, I'm pretty confident with my answers, but occasionally there are going to be some borderline situations where I will frankly acknowledge that I'm not sure, and I will give you what I think is my best argument for my answer. Okay, so the whole point of this is that handling sources is messy. We have guidelines that we can apply to our assessments, but like so many things in research, it's kind of an art as well. Okay, so source one, scholarly or non-scholarly source. Well, we'll look at this and we're going to say it's a non-scholarly source, right? It is relatively short. It is not deeply specialized in its language, and probably most obviously it lacks a bibliography or works cited page or in-text citations or footnotes. All of the things that we sometimes call, get ready for it, a scholarly apparatus. That's right, ladies and gentlemen, scholarly apparatus. That's a fancy term that refers to things like citations, documentation, footnotes, bibliography, works cited page, right? This doesn't have that. It has relatively straightforward language, not necessarily highly specialized, so it is a non-scholarly source. It is probably also, looking at it sort of a news article, it's probably safe to say that because it's reporting on other studies and it's examining other studies that have been done and it is reporting on them, that this is a secondary source. It's not generating brand new knowledge, for example, which would make it a primary source. And it's not like an encyclopedia entry. So this is a non-scholarly secondary source. Source two, look at this. Look at this long, boring title. Look at this journal title, Educational Theory, right? This is a scholarly source, okay? It has tons of footnotes on every page. In fact, on some pages, there are more footnotes than actual text. You'll see there are lots of footnotes and lengthy ones, right? So that's a huge tip-off that you're dealing with a scholarly source. It has a thick scholarly apparatus citing lots of other scholarly sources throughout. It is quite long. I hope you notice that. It is a very long source. Generally, scholarly sources tend toward the long side. We can also note that the author's credentials are foregrounded here, right at the top, right? They're associated with these schools. We'll also notice that this has an abstract right here, okay? The abstract, that tells us that it's a summary of the piece. Scholarly sources generally have abstracts. Not in every case, but very often. And we'll note that it's a boring journal title. The language is very dense and specialized, and so on. And because this is a piece in education, and it looks like it is examining other studies that have been done, I think we would call this, on my reading of it, a secondary source. It doesn't look like they're reporting that they're generating their own new study, but it looks like they're offering recommendations and an analysis of other studies. So this is a secondary source, a scholarly secondary source. Source 3. Source 3 is a non-scholarly source. It is lacking the scholarly apparatus, right? We don't have footnotes or endnotes or bibliography exactly, or a works cited page. We do have some references at the end. Sometimes that does happen in non-scholarly sources, but it's not a very thick scholarly apparatus. It's also quite short, and the language isn't exactly specialized. It has advertisements. So this is a non-scholarly source, and this is actually a trade journal publication. So non-scholarly, and it's a trade journal, and it looks like it's reporting on the state of some aspect of the field here. It's not generating new knowledge, so we'd probably call this a secondary source as well, because it's reporting on other matters, but not creating its own knowledge. Source 4 is the Yale Law Journal. Well, by goodness, that should be enough to tell you it's a scholarly source. It's a law journal. Law journals are peer-reviewed scholarly sources. Other things you could say to help you identify it as a scholarly source: it's extremely long. It has fairly specialized language. The footnotes are lengthy and thick and detailed all throughout the piece, right? That's a very thick scholarly apparatus. It has an abstract right here. We also note it has one author, Joseph Blocker, and we learn right here all about that author, all of his credentials, their academic credentials. So that's all scholarly source, right? Now this is a little bit difficult to identify as a primary or secondary source, because it is generating its own knowledge, right? It's making new knowledge, in this case, knowledge of the law. However, you might remember I said in the module, in the humanities, we generally consider scholarly sources secondary sources, because they are almost always studying something else, usually something like a text or a document or a law, right? And that's what this is doing. It's studying the text of laws and the legal precedents that grow out of the law. So it is a scholarly source, and it is a secondary source. Source 5 is a weird source, which is why I gave it to you. You might run into something like this on the open web. It looks like a government report. It's published by the United States Secret Service and the U.S. Department of Education. And it looks like it is an original report and analysis of this particular situation in the United States. But it's not scholarly simply because it's not appearing in a journal devoted to publishing new scholarly information. It's more of a government report. So it is non-scholarly, okay, even though it has an abstract, right? It's not been through peer review because it's a government report. So it has an abstract. That might throw you, like, wait, it has an abstract. It should be scholarly. Well, in this case, because it's a government report, even though it has an abstract, we would strictly speaking consider it non-scholarly, although still very good. And if it is generating its own information, if it is its own study and it's reporting on its own data, which it looks like a good part of this is, we would consider it a primary source. Okay, this is a primary source. There might be elements of it as you dip through it that are secondary because they report on other studies. So some parts of it might be secondary, but a lot of this looks like its own analysis of the effectiveness of this initiative. So it is a primary source, non-scholarly, with sections that might be secondary. Source 6 is non-scholarly. No footnotes, no endnotes, no works cited, no in-text citation, no bibliography. It's a news source, not very long. Sexy title, illustrations, all of that shows that it's a non-scholarly source. It's published in The Atlantic, which is a news outlet. language is pretty approachable. So non-scholarly source, and because this is a news source that is reporting on a bunch of other primary sources, other studies and other data, it's probably in the secondary source category rather than a primary source. News stories can sometimes be primary depending on how close they are to what they're reporting. This looks like more of a removed kind of analysis of a whole situation that is also referring to studies and so on. So it's a secondary source and a non-scholarly source. Source 7, scholarly source, right? Long, boring title. We have an abstract here. That's what that is, an abstract. It's in Policy Studies Journal, which is a typical scholarly journal sounding kind of name. It is very dense and jam-packed with citations. That's a huge tip-off that it's scholarly. This one also has these subheadings like methodology. It has data tables in it, right? It's generating its own knowledge. I'm sorry, one of my children is acting like a drunk monkey in the other room, so apologies if you can hear that. So this is a scholarly source, long, full of information, full of data tables and charts. It has, look at the references and the notes at the end. Huge, right? Scholarly source. And this one is probably a secondary source, generally speaking, because it looks like it's surveying. Well, actually, let me back that up. It's got a research methodology, which suggests that it's looking very carefully at something directly. But my guess upon a skim is that it is analyzing other studies and the history of other studies. So this would probably make it a secondary source, a scholarly secondary source, again, because it looks like it is analyzing other studies. But if it's generating its own studies, right, its own contrived studies and testing them, then it could fall into the primary source category, right? My gut here on this is that it leans more towards a secondary scholarly source rather than a primary one, because it's really reporting on it's analyzing other studies. Source 8, this is a Supreme Court decision, right? So I told you expressly the text of court decisions and of laws are always primary sources. So this is a primary source. Yes, it has footnotes and references. Yeah, great, but it's a Supreme Court case. It is making law. It is a thing that we would study, right, directly. So it is a primary source. It is the text of a court case or a law, which makes it a primary source. And because it has not undergone peer review, and it's not published in a scholarly journal or scholarly university press, it's actually a non-scholarly source. That doesn't mean it's a bad source. I mean, my goodness, this is the text of a Supreme Court decision, right? But it's a primary source and a non-scholarly source. Source 8, a weird, confusing source. This is a specialized encyclopedia, right? It's got an encyclopedia entry on gun control. It's got a lot of information on that topic. It actually has this full-page insert here, too. This is the actual rest of the article back here. Relatively short. It doesn't have a huge scholarly apparatus, but it's still written by what seems to be an expert. But it's giving you an overview of the topic, right? And that would make it an encyclopedia. And encyclopedia sources, and like this American Law Yearbook, are generally considered tertiary sources. They are overviews of a topic, starting places for a topic, encyclopedic sources, reference sources. And finally, source 10, we have scholarly affiliations right here. We have what's called an objective, which is essentially an abstract. Okay, it's got a long, boring title, and it's published in Social Science Quarterly, which is published by the Southwestern Social Science Association. Scholarly source, right? It's long. It's heavily referenced and footnoted. If you go to the end, you'll see a bunch of references here. And you'll also see some undigested data tables here as well. If we look at the abstract, we could see that it is a social science article. It employs particular social science methods for analysis, and it looks like it's its own study, and it's generating new knowledge directly. So this would make it a primary source, a primary scholarly source. The fact that it's a social science journal will generally suggest that it's a primary source, because as a rule of thumb, social sciences and hard sciences, their scholarly publications are usually original studies conducted by the scholars and scientists themselves, and that makes them primary, right? Scholarly sources in the humanities, like philosophy, law, and that sort of thing, history, literature, those tend to be secondary sources, even when they're scholarly, because they are analyzing historical documents and other documents. So they are secondary sources. Okay, now let's look at MLA citation. First, let's just show you my cheat sheet. Your works cited page should have looked something like this. Alphabetized, right, for all 10 of these sources. So let's take a look. Yeah, look at that. Looks pretty, doesn't it? Yours should look like this. Size 12 Times New Roman, double spaced, alphabetized using hanging indent. So look back at yours. Did you do that? Also notice, generally speaking, we have complete information. We have put article titles in quote marks, here and here. But then we put publication titles like that in italics. Remember that. Quote marks for article titles. Italics for publication titles. Notice we also have publication information following the title, including page numbers where appropriate. Okay. And we also have database information tacked on along with access dates. I always include access dates, even though strictly speaking you don't have to, but I think it's always good to cover all our bases. So the access dates are tacked on to the end. Notice here's your Supreme Court case. This was actually used in your Little Seagull handbook as an example for court cases, so it should look like this. Okay. And then here's the gun control, that tertiary source. It looks a little weird. It has no author, so when you have no author, you just go with the title of the article. Notice that database titles are also italicized. Okay, so yours should do that. Yours should do that. And then here's that wacky looking source, source 5, I believe, which has a bunch of authors, and you could cite it this way, with the first author and et al. That actually should be et al. Like that. And then italicized report title, and the publication, the publishing agencies here, they're agencies, so they don't get capitalized because they're not titles, but they are the agencies, the date, how it was accessed. So yours should look like that. I will give you a general comment on yours in Canvas, but just know this is the baseline. Yours should look like this. Some of yours do, I noticed, and that's really cool. Others of yours, kind of there, so pay attention. Yours should look like this. Okay, final thing. Why did I have you do this activity? Because I'm a sadist and I want to cause you pain. No, that's not true. Because I want you to get comfortable with identifying source information, right? You're not always going to have a database doing the citation for you, right? You might, in your research, end up looking at something like this on the web, and it's not going to be able to have a clear citation for you. It might give you some suggestions, like here, but that may or may not be useful, right? What if you find this online? It's a really interesting and good source. How do you cite it, right? So I wanted you to get some experience having to figure out how to cite it by looking at the document. That's the first reason. Well, actually, that's the main reason, right? I suppose the second reason is to give you just a sense of how to tell the different kinds of sources you're looking at when you are looking at documents, right? Just get some visual information literacy. A couple last things I'll leave with you, right? When you need to figure out how to cite a source, you have two options, okay? One is, I'm going to switch this to me. Hi, guys. One is this fella, right, your Little Seagull handbook. You can use it by, when you're looking at a source, turning to the beginning of the MLA section, which will be that weird puke green looking header, right? And you'll see these pages here, they give you a list of source types. And if you want to use this to help you, what you want to do is find the description of the source type that best fits the source you are looking at. Go to that page and then look at that source entry for how you would cite it. Right? So, here's how you do an article access through a database. It gives you a kind of a template and an example. Okay? All sorts of source types are given to you here, right? So make use of this little fellow. That's why I had you buy it. You have another source. You can go to our shell, go down to my resources. You'll see here you've got ways to do MLA documentation. One way you can do this is to actually look at the MLA style homepage. Okay, click on that. And it will look like this. I've just gone to it here. Then if you look at the works cited, a quick guide, you'll see that MLA actually gives you this general set of principles for finding source information and organizing it. MLA works cited entries follow these 9 pieces of information in that order. See that? Any source in MLA, you list the information for that source in the works cited entry in this order. Author, the title of the source, the title of the container, or what I have been calling the publication, right? The larger publication that contains your source. You might have other contributors like translators or editors. You might have a version number or a version or a volume. You might have a number or an issue number, a publisher, a publication date, and then a location. Okay? And if you look at this template, it walks you through like some little examples, right? Here's how you'd use the template of 9 elements for this book here, right? Here's the author, title of source, the title of the container, and so on. And you'll notice that when something is missing from your source, maybe it doesn't have a version number, a version or a number, right? Then you leave those out. You leave those out. So if it doesn't have an author, you leave out the author and you just go to the next element, like they do here. There's no author for this website, right? So the first thing in your entry would then be the title of the source, and so on, right? So interact with this, okay? You can interact with this. MLA website also gives you this template, which helps you graphically organize information for a citation. So you could use that to remind you, oh yeah, it's author, title of source, title of container, and so on. You can also access from our modules our libraries. It's this one. Our libraries sort of detailed version of the same thing, right? Here are the 9 elements from MLA: author, title of source, title of container, other contributors, version, number, publisher, publication date, location. And then it will give you some examples in the right-hand column of what that might look like depending on the source you're looking at. And of course, you can also use the Purdue OWL formatting and style guide, which I've just linked here, right? Which can give you some tips on MLA style. Okay, and here's their list from MLA, right? The 9 elements. So again, use Little Seagull Handbook to look up the source type, and that can often give you a pretty clear template to use. You can also use these other resources here for when you're trying to format an MLA citation. So if you're not in a database that automatically generates your citation, you have tools to figure out how to formulate your citations in MLA style. So make use of them and practice using them when you're forming your works cited page. Good job on the assignments, guys. So look at your feedback and take this general feedback into consideration as well. And good luck in your researching.